Hey everybody, Rob here. It's time for a couple of brand new pro-revenge stories. First one, landlord tries to rip me off for £400, ends up having to pay me over £6,500. Let's jump right in. Please hit that subscribe button because I'm not a robot. Last year, I moved out of a house that I had rented for 5 years with no problems. I always had a good relationship with the landlord. There are two relevant bits of background to this story. One, in the UK where I live, the standard practice when renting a house is to sign a tenancy agreement for a year. At the end of the year, if you want to stay in the house and the landlord is happy with that, you can just do nothing and the tenancy will continue automatically until either tenant or landlord gives notice. Alternatively, you can sign a new 1-year tenancy agreement each year, which isn't really necessary, but some landlords want it. My landlord wanted me to sign a new tenancy agreement each year. Fine, whatever. So, since I rented the house for 5 years, there were 5 tenancy agreements in total. 2. By law, the landlord was required to protect my security deposit. That meant that she had to put it into a special kind of account within 30 days of receiving it. The tenant then receives login details for the account so that they can check that it's protected and view various info about it. One point of doing this is so that the deposit is held by an independent party who can mediate if the landlord and tenant disagree about any deductions. There is a dispute process that the tenant can request and which is free for the tenant to use. So I'd been living in the house for almost 5 years and I gave notice to end the tenancy because I was buying a house. After I'd given notice, the landlord emailed me to ask if I was planning to hire a gardener to ensure that the garden would be returned to the pretty manicured state it was in when I moved in. I thought this was strange because my tenancy agreement explicitly forbade me from doing the sorts of things in the garden that would have been necessary to maintain its original state. Example, it said that I was not allowed to lop any shrubs or bushes. So all I'd been doing is cutting the grass and the hedge. Basically, that clause looked like something that a landlord would include if they planned to maintain the garden themselves, except she didn't maintain it while I was living there. In retrospect, it seems that she didn't read her own tenancy agreement properly. I replied to the landlord's email about the garden. I quoted the part of the tenancy agreement that forbade me from doing certain things in the garden and expressed my confusion. I asked her to clarify what her expectations were about the state of the garden, given what it said in the tenancy agreement. She didn't reply, but a couple weeks later, I received an email from her husband or boyfriend telling me that the landlord was anxious about the garden and I should ensure that it is returned to the same state as at the start of the tenancy. I replied to him and again asked for clarification given the wording of the tenancy agreement. He replied saying he'd have the landlord get back to me herself, which she never did. Without any guidance about the garden, I just did my best with it. My boyfriend, who is an experienced gardener, did the work here. I asked him to just do whatever he thought was best. He cut back bushes and cleared loads of stuff. I spent a few £100 on having garden waste removed. I knew that technically I did not need to do that, but wanted to do what I could to keep relations good between me and the landlord. I moved out, the tenancy ended, and after not hearing anything from the landlord for a couple of weeks and not having my deposit back, I emailed the landlord to ask about the deposit. Having ignored my queries about the garden before the end of the tenancy, she chose this moment to announce that she wanted to deduct £400 from my deposit to carry out work on the garden. There followed a really time-wasting back and forth by email in which I pointed out that the terms of the tenancy agreement were incompatible with my being able to maintain the original state of the garden, and she just kept repeating that the garden was not returned to her in its original state. In the end, I suggested that since we couldn't agree about deductions from my deposit, we should use the independent dispute process offered by the company that was holding the deposit. That process needs to be kicked off by the landlord, so I asked her to authorize it. She didn't do that. Instead, she kept wasting my time by sending me emails trying to negotiate an amount to put the garden right, which I wasn't going to entertain. Meanwhile, I could not log into the account where my deposit was being held. I contacted the company, and it turned out that my landlord had accidentally input my email address incorrectly when registering the deposit, which I found very strange because she had emailed me successfully dozens of times throughout the time I was living in the house. So she definitely knew my email address. Without being able to log in, I was unable to officially dispute any deductions she was proposing. There is a window of 3 months after the end of the tenancy when you can dispute any deductions. After that, you either take what the landlord is willing to return or go to court. Apparently, according to Justice for Tenants, who I contacted for advice, it's relatively common for unscrupulous landlords to register their tenants' details incorrectly in an attempt to make it harder for them to recover their deposits in the time frame available for disputes. I had a long back and forth with the deposit company, after which I finally gained access to my deposit account. When I got into it, I looked at the info and noticed that the landlord had not protected my deposit until the day after I gave her notice to end the tenancy. That meant she protected my deposit well after the 30-day deadline by which she was supposed to do it by law. There are penalties for landlords that fail to comply with the laws around tenancy deposits. If they break the rules and the tenant takes them to court, they have to return the full deposit plus between 1 and 3 times the amount of the deposit as compensation. Also, they are not allowed to make any deductions from a tenant's deposit if they haven't complied with the law. I emailed the landlady a bit more firmly than I had previously. Things had been cordial but increasingly frosty. I pointed out that she could not make any deductions from my deposit because she had not complied with the law. She responded by sending me quite a tantrumy, insulting email and authorizing the return of my full deposit. So yay for the deposit back, but what a bitch insulting me when I hadn't done anything wrong. I was pissed off by the fact that she tried to rip me off and wasted hours and hours of my time trying to sort this out. Not to mention the stress. Just seeing an email from her land in my inbox caused my stomach to flip by this point. This is when things started to get a bit more exciting. As I said above, landlords who don't comply with the law around tenancy deposits have to pay between 1 and 3 times the value of the deposit in compensation, plus return the full deposit if they get taken to court. The documentation from the tenancy deposit scheme proved that she had broken the law. I'd already had my deposit back, but it was clear that if I took her to court, I would receive a minimum of that amount again. Except, of course, I didn't have just the one tenancy agreement with her. As I already mentioned, she had insisted on my signing a new tenancy agreement every year, so I'd had 5 tenancy agreements in total. I spent a few hours checking the law and going through old emails and documentation, and it turns out that she had failed to protect my deposit correctly in all of the 5 tenancies I had with her. I had a ton of documentation to prove that. That meant that if I took her to court, I stood to receive a minimum of not 1, but 5 times the amount of my original deposit, over £6,500. It would cost me a couple of £100 to take her to court, and I was 100% willing to do that. In fact, at this point, I was relishing that prospect. In order to take her to court, I first had to send her a letter before action in which I set out my complaint against her and gave her an opportunity to make an offer to avoid going to court. I had a barrister friend who was helping me out at this point with advice for free. The landlord replied to my letter quite dismissively, basically saying that it was clearly just an admin error that caused her to fail to protect my deposit correctly every year for 5 years, laugh out loud, and accusing me of being motivated by a windfall. I replied by email, correcting her various mistaken assumptions and repeating the need for her to make an offer in order to avoid court. After a while, she replied and offered me £4,000. I told her that the minimum I would accept was a little over £6,500, I forget the exact figure, since that was the minimum I would stand to get in court. She agreed, with certain conditions attached, perhaps conditions that she thought I might not be able to fulfill, things like sending her copies of all the documentation relating to the deposit for previous year's tenancies, but which I was able to do immediately. When the money landed in my bank account, I emailed her to explain that I would have dropped my complaint against her immediately had she at any point offered a sincere apology, which was true, at least up until that final email where she insulted me. I also said that I hoped she would deal more fairly and reasonably with future tenants. She didn't reply. I hope that I will never again be a tenant, but having spent many years being dicked around by shitty landlords and letting agents, it was satisfying to end my renting days with such a satisfying and profitable middle finger. OP mentions in the comments that with their new little windfall they bought some furniture, but at the moment they're sitting on the rest of it because of the uncertain times that we're in. On to our next story. Taking down Queen Karen, president of the HOA. Let's jump right in. Okay, this happened years ago, 1985 to be exact. I was 45 when this happened, 81 now. So after my second retirement, I started doing property management. I bought this 2,500 square foot luxury home in with the sole intention of renting it out. Now, I didn't know how bad the HOA was, but when I became the owner, I soon found out. This all took place in 2 years' time. Karen would literally have a problem with everyone in the neighborhood. Trash cans left out, fined. Loud music after 10 p.m., fined. Yard sale without permission, fine. Removing dead plants and replanting without approval, you get fined. It went on and on like this. Now, the community could run for the HOA board, but the HOA board chose the president. 6 out of the 10 members on the board liked Karen, so she always kept her job. Her husband was in the medical field, so he made a lot of money. It got to a point too where she was called Queen Karen in the neighborhood, and her dishing out HOA fines. Now, I used to go in person to collect the rent because the people that rented my house were good friends of mine. I did this for months, so I would park my car by the front of the garage. I and my friends were having some music on, but it wasn't that loud. Queen Karen came over driving her golf cart and said, "Excuse me." "Yeah?" "You have to turn that music down, it's too loud." I told her that it was 8 p.m. and that music that's even loud can be played until 10. She wasn't having it and demanded that I do so. Now my friends and I kept the music going and we were enjoying ourselves. She proceeded to get angry and fined me. Now, most people will just take the abuse and pay the fine, but not me. I went to the HOA board, contested the fine, and won. From that point on, Queen Karen made it her personal mission to destroy me. She would bitch and fuss about every little thing. I fought what I could, but I did end up paying for some of it. She also went after my tenants, which made things worse for me. I had a sit down with my friends one night to discuss the problem. When I parked my car, Queen Karen came over in her robe and said I have to park somewhere else. I did, because I didn't want to start anything. We see her go back into her house and embrace a man that isn't her husband. We were being nosy, and we came to the conclusion that she was cheating on her husband. Spoiler alert, she was. My friend and I told Queen Karen's husband. I'm sure he did some investigation, because 3 months later they divorced, and he was moving his stuff out. Now gossip said that Queen Karen got nothing because she was the one that cheated and she didn't have a job, so she wasn't entitled to the money. From this point on, Queen Karen had a massive decline in the quality of life that she had. She sold her car and got a cheaper one, and she adopted different dressing habits. But even after the divorce, she never got a job. and she was still living somewhat better than everyone else. Fast forward to 1986 in February, Queen Karen and the HOA had been giving out fines for very obscure things and increased monthly dues. Having trash cans out a couple hours early or after the trash man left would result in a fine. Targeting people that had older or dirty cars goes on and on. Me and the other people in the community were sick of the crap that she and the HOA was pulling, so at the next meeting, we voiced our concerns. Queen Karen said that the community had been falling behind on repairs and that the dues and increase in fines were necessary, especially if people weren't maintaining their own property. She said that it was in the yearly budget report and that we should have read it. The other pissed residents and I go and read the statement. Now, none of us read it because we take it as a junk mail and disregard it, but we read the whole statement cover to cover. Queen had increased the HOA budget 15%, and where that extra money was going remained unknown. We went over to her house the next day and demanded to know where the extra money was being spent, but she refused several times. She closed the door and went back to watching TV. We filed a joint lawsuit to find out where the money was going. In June, we found out. Cue the revenge. Queen Karen was living off HOA fines and dues. The increase is because she was running out of money. She still didn't have a job, so she embezzled from the HOA so she wouldn't have to get a job. She gets busted. We called the police for her embezzling the money. She was charged with fraud and extortion. The neighbors and I filed a joint lawsuit against Karen to get reimbursement as well. Because she had no money, so she had to mortgage her house to pay us all. She later went to federal prison for 6 years with no parole. Because she went away, no one was paying on her house. The bank foreclosed on it, and it was bought by someone else. So when she got out in 1992, she was homeless. Honestly, the majority of us didn't want to ruin her life like this. Had she toned down the excessive fines, we would have let her be, but she had to double down and steal from us because she didn't want to get a job like everyone else. Don't you just hate Karens like this? It's like they feel entitled to everything they can get their hands on. Ugh. I'd like to thank both OPs for posting their stories to the ProRevenge subreddit. You can visit them at the links in the description below. Please go there and give them an upvote. Once again, this is Rob from Karma Comment Chameleon saying thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with your friends. And we'll see you in the next one.